thank you for the introduction. And I've lived in Colorado since 2006. And it's been wonderful for me coming from all the way from France and moving slowly west, and now just really feel at home here in this region. I just love how much in transformation Colorado is. And so when describing for today some aspects of the work I do, I was fortunate to start practicing landscape architecture with a focus on public gardens. And I came from way back in Boston and in Virginia and in Colorado, and working quite a bit with Herb Scholl. I don't know if Herb Scholl is in the conference today. I want to say hi. He was one of my mentors. And one thing I love to talk about when I talk to the students, and actually I teach not at DU, I teach at UCD, University of Colorado, Denver, right at Larimer Square. And one thing I often tell the students is it's interesting to try to describe what is landscape architecture. One thing I feel I'm much more excited about is the notion of place, and place as kind of being the intersection of many different fields or voices. And it is a landscape, but it's also the economics, culture, and ecology. And I love to think of that intersection between those different disciplines. And what I love about place, to me, it's always in mutation. And what was a certain place 100 years ago has evolved to a new place. And that's how that cultural come into play. And in making is something maybe I learned from being more practicing art before, which is believing in findings through making, and how we're always kind of discovering things. So those two words together to me mean a lot about what I do as a research on crafting outdoor spaces that are meaningful to people, but also really enhance biodiversity and the environment we live with or in. So we've done a number of projects in Denver, including with the Denver Botanic Garden. There was a sensory garden we did a few years ago, the renovation of that courtyard, and a great place for people, almost like an outdoor room for people to connect to plants. And I love the program that Lee here in the photograph is able to do with a lot of people with special needs that come in and are able to connect and communicate and connect through the touch of plants and sharing stories. Another project I did many years ago was at Penn State with a children's garden, really a place for children to feel safe and free to explore on their own and not have the parents follow them, and really kind of explore the natural world. And that sense of exploration, I think, and it's something really exciting that I want to pursue, mostly in the crafting of urban spaces. So we don't have to just wait until we find a children's garden to be creating some of those very inspiring, energizing moments in the outdoor, but actually realizing that some of the lessons learned from that can you use in other spaces. We did also things in Phoenix with the Desert Botanical Garden. Here was a larger master plan for their future children and family garden. Those are some of those images from it. And really, I just find so much inspiration for within nature. And then what I love about art is, the process of revealing, and there's so much magic to be found. And I think when we work together with like the Denver Botanical Garden, creating moments and gardens within the landscape that allow people to, while they're having fun, they're being social. This was before COVID, as you can tell. I hope we can go back to this, but just how you find those very meaningful moments to reconnect to something essential to you, and health and well-being, and integrating art in the gardens. So anyway, today what I wanted to reflect on in some ways, what I find so powerful about working with you all in horticulture and botanical garden is the power you have, I think, in affecting change in the way you could rethink the way we care for landscape in cities, or how we design landscape in the cities. And so some keywords: ecology, climate, and pollinators. Some of the hot topics in some ways, but I think that kind of convey in my mind why it's so essential, the role you play today in, like Tim was describing, all the expansion and the broad spectrum and access to so many different species of oaks, for example, is just one example of how we can do better and not have just 3 trees to choose from, and how we can really expand that palette. So let's start with ecology. and it relates to topography, water, and collections. And one project I wanted to kind of discuss as a way of reflecting on the power of public gardens in the shaping of our cities is a recent project we did with Kelly Norris and Stephanie Jutala at the Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden. And we just did this master plan and just completed it, and we're about to start the next phase of design. But their garden is very interesting, where it's a fairly young garden. They opened about 6-7 years ago, and I've expanded since then. And then we're looking at growing the next 7 acres. It's kind of compressed in space, and partly due to a very interesting topography, where you have a steep slope and then the river on the other side. And so it's kind of within a wedge of that landscape. And some of the big ideas that came with the group was, how do we engage with the river? How do we engage with the community? How do we expand the garden collections? And how we can plan for increased visitation. And in some ways, what the garden wants to become is a very essential hub, a place for people to connect to their region and landscape, and also reflect on new practices, new opportunities with plants, and how to create a more diverse, more healthy environments. What we found interesting through this project is that why is this garden there, and what is the potential of this site? So we always love to look back at the history of that landscape and that site. And what's amazing is that this garden that I highlighted in yellow here within the city of Des Moines just happens to be right at the southern tip of a lobe of a glacier deposit. So it's kind of amazing when you want to talk about climate change or landscape is changing. What I think is very healthy for everybody and children to realize that landscape and place is always evolving, has always been evolving. And in some ways, it's kind of wonderful to think together of how is it going to further evolve, and how can we almost manage that evolution and transformation and not try to be so static. So realizing that the landscape you live in was formed by glaciers and deposits, and the rivers and carving into that material and exposing different soil profiles, and how the plant communities inhabit those different terrains, to me is very fascinating. And so here's that map showing where the garden is in that zone. And this is kind of, it's a bit beyond what I want to talk about here, but it just shows how dynamic the landscape is. And so that's also part of why I love the notion of place. It's not like when we think of landscape, it's like this landscape to be looked at, almost like a postcard, and realizing what we live in is always transforming. And so when we were thinking, what does that mean to plan for the next 20 years, the expansion of this great garden by the river, is by connecting in some ways to the deeper history of the place. There's an opportunity to suddenly rethink how we may curate collections, and how we curate the visitor's experience, and how we mesh people and plants in a very emotional, powerful way. I think the power of botanical gardens is often to inspire. It's not really, people learn so much as they walk through places. They emotionally connect at different times of the day, different seasons, to different parts of the garden. I just find wonderful to see. I've been at the Denver Botanic Gardens so many times working with them, and I'd always observe where do people really go. And it's just fascinating to see how different time of the year people tend to maybe connect to different parts of the garden. So here we're looking at that section, and you can see how dynamic that is, that section, and what it would mean to connect to the upland versus inhabit that transect in some ways, and all the way down to the river. And I mean, almost ecotones exist along that profile, and how different soil conditions you could find. And so if you try to expand diversity, being very aware of all of those conditions, and maybe even further enhance, further highlight those contrasts of conditions, you realize you could really expand the potentials of biodiversity within those spaces. Here's kind of the notion of transect across those different landscape, and all of the different zones that with Kelly Norris we started to look into. And he was particularly excited to see how we could overlap those different plant collections and zones, and how people are woven into and through those different places, not unlike the way I was describing the way we almost orchestrate how children could play into a nature play garden or a family garden. by really creating a sense of discovery. I think we never stop being children, really. And when you put people into a beautiful place like a botanical garden, a place of science and research and science, there's also a lot of element of fun in it. And I think that's kind of what we were trying to explore here with the topography and those different zones. How do we bring that sense of passion and love and fun in connecting with the outdoor? And so why it matters is that if you look at, you know, this garden within its community and the city, you realize by being by the river, and by the way, you know, like most American cities, the city is there in the first place because of the river, the water being source of life and all the vegetation and the wildlife around it. And then as cities grew in the 40s and 50s with engineering and industries, sometimes some of the cities have forgotten their river. And so it's kind of powerful to see how this garden being by the river can become a pretty amazing source of inspiration of how the city reinvents itself again and connects to the river, and look at the whole waterfront as a place for wildlife, biodiversity, art, culture, different cultures and diversities. So that was kind of one reflection on that topic, on connecting to place and its ecology in some ways. And then I want to talk about climate, something that has been so talked about recently and has become very political instead of just scientific, which is in some ways somehow a problem. But what I want to share with you is a project that, and many of you have seen it already, obviously, the Steppe Garden at the Denver Botanic Garden. And I just wanted to share with you in some ways the story I've seen from our own perspective as designer and what it could mean to the shaping and making of the city of Denver. You know, when I arrived to Denver at first, I was really amazed of, to me, it looked like a concrete jungle. When you first drive in Denver, it's a lot of the serpentine highways and so forth. And so the opportunity of going into this very disturbed landscape, and for the Denver Botanical Garden to think about placing right in the center a living collection of their central research on the steppe biome, which is found in 4 different regions in the world, and realizing we live in one of the largest steppe region here. And in some ways, the city of Denver has been pushing away that landscape. So the idea of reintroducing in the middle of the garden, in the middle of the city of Denver, that landscape of the steppe biome, I think this was a very powerful story, and also very complex for people in the middle of downtown Denver to think, how do I connect to that landscape, and what is the steppe landscape all about? When I grew up, I always thought the steppe landscape is in Mongolia, and I thought of this vast landscape and the big sky. I never thought that Denver, I never knew that it was in a steppe landscape. And so something very powerful, I think, again here for a public garden is to inspire and educate and help people connect to their region in a very dynamic and fun way. It's not about a nostalgia of what was lost, but it's kind of how we do better in some ways in reconnecting to that sense of place and biodiversity. So here is a plan view of it. And the site is about 3/4 of an acre, so very small, and surrounded with some of the oaks we just talked about. Actually, I think there's some great Quercus turbinella on the northwest there, and some of the cottonwoods in it. But within that little garden room, in some ways, how do we create this vignette or emotional connection to the larger landscape was a big challenge. And here is kind of an aerial view of the garden after its installation. And what I want to share with you is how can you craft within the city a landscape that is extremely rich and dynamic and fun within a small scale, and yet connect people to a larger landscape. So here is Mike Bone, and I think this was in, actually I can't even remember which region this was, but this is a great publication by the Denver Botanical Garden on a steppe landscape. And you can see how, whether you're in Patagonia, Central Asia, South Africa, or North America, what those regions have in common is the fact that there's this very dynamic sculpted landscape, and how the steppe biome was created by the creation of mountains that block rainfall and create this semi-arid, elevated landscape. And so the lesson I learned from that is that even through those hard, challenging time of transformation, it's kind of powerful to see the adaptation of those plant species and find what they have in common across those different regions. Here is kind of a map. When we started the story, it was overwhelming, I must admit, where we had a lot of people from the great team of horticulture at the Denver Botanic Garden, and Sharada and Magon and Piquet and Mike, and they gave us this big 50 pages long kind of recommendations of different conditions they wanted to create and how we had to have those 4 regions. And so when we were starting to map over what used to be the AAS garden in Denver, it was like, how can we possibly even tell all those stories in one place? So we kind of borrowed a little bit of that turf hill beyond the water to kind of expand, but also it would have felt funny to look at the steppe biome and see the turf in the background. So I think by expanding and creating the Patagonia area in the background, we kind of allowed visitors to feel very immersed in that landscape. Here are some of the early studies. So one thing I always talk about, and when I tell the students about landscape or place, is how dynamic and how 3-dimensional or multi-dimensional it is. And so what early sketches was all about, how do we make the garden look larger than it really is? And how do we feel like you cannot see it all in one shot, but how do you find your way through and entice a sense of discovery? But also realizing that part of why this landscape is there, or those plants are there, is that because the ground shifted. It was really, to me, important to think, how do people not have to read signs to know that what created the steppe biome is a shift of the ground plane and a creation of uplift and mountains. And so creating a terrain or topography that could right away not only create that sense of discovery, but upfront convey to everyone that what created this new biome and ecology and is through that transformation. And so here's the model we were trying to figure out. We were working with this amazing stone artist, Thad, and how to place a stone, use no concrete that wouldn't leach any lime into the soil and so forth, and how to create this gesture, this sculpture. And then to think later how it affects how you move. So we do multiple iterations of model, and we do it even digitally, place ourselves in it, and really try to understand how tall is too tall, how low is too low, and really kind of find the right scale for this space. And here are some of the drawings trying to understand how we could make the ground look like unstable. It is safe and stable when you go there, but we wanted to make you feel like it's still moving in some ways. And even the whole plan view is all about almost like ripples, where the landscape looks like it's peeling out and expanding slowly. What it does, most importantly, is through the goal of shifting all this, beside the experience, was we wanted to create all those different soil conditions, different solar exposure, different, some more xeric areas versus much more wet and lush areas. And so contrasting all those different conditions side by side is one of the powerful aspects of playing with that topography, which to me relates to how can we make the cities more engaging and diverse and interesting, is instead of thinking of the ground plane always so much more tuned, how can we make it a lot more interesting and rich. So here's some photographs of this space and how it creates that collection. This is the part of the African zone next to the spine versus you're looking in the background here as that Patagonia area that used to be turf that we transformed. Here's when it was just installed. So this tool's like it looks like a stone quarry at that time, but we were really careful about, it's interesting actually, the stone is extracted from a quarry very nearby that is in the steppe biome itself. So it's kind of fun to connect all the dots. But as it grows, it's going to be a lot less stone exposed and much more of the different species. But what I thought was really fun and powerful is that you can see the mountains in the distance. And to me, it was a reflection on how do we bring almost a constructed living collection or fragment of the outside landscape into the city, and creating that kind of dialogue and that reflection on where we are and where do we want to go with this knowledge and landscape. It doesn't prevent, even though it's this amazing science and research, from people to have just a great time and just wanting to be there and connect with one another. Or for children to, while playing and discovering, realize how water is such a precious resource within our landscape. So this stone sculpture is inspired after some of the shrubs that are sculpted by wind, the pillow pillow shrubs in Patagonia. And so it's this very rounded shape, and plants will grow within that stone, and kind of tells the story of the shifting of the ground plane and plants adapting to it. But then within it, there's that little bit of source of water, and that little girl, that's kind of what she's finding right there. So you hear the sound of water before you find it and touch it and connect to it. Here it is within the Sea of Denver. And so we created this little graphic, and what we wanted to tell with that story is what is the value or power of that garden. And if you think about it, on the upper left, we're describing almost the knowledge as this journey or trail, and you start with that many years of research and seed collection and discoveries, and then start to work on that publication, which is all of the work that for 15 years or more was done by the amazing team at DBG. And in some way, the garden is just one, we drew it as a little bubble there, one tool for disseminating that sense of knowledge. But what's powerful is to have a publication, and then in some ways the garden is a publication and a source of inspiration of how to use better plants, better adapted to our climate, and how this garden with Plant Select and those nurseries now developing those new cultivars can completely transform the way someone might think of doing their front yard, for example. And to me, that's where it becomes really magical to think of, it's not just doing a garden for a garden or as a great place for people. It's really has an effect on how we could transform the region together. So I just want to share that story in that regard. And then I want to talk about one third project. And that's a project we're doing with the Arboretum at Penn State. And it's, they have on our faculty, they have a Center for Research on Pollinators, pretty incredible people doing lectures all over the world and research with France and Germany and other regions everywhere in the world. And they wanted to do a garden, pollinators garden and bird garden. And it's about 4 acres. And what they wanted to do is kind of convey as a living collection all of the research being done to date on pollinators and why it matters. And what I find so powerful to me in that story is that I have children and they come home from school. They've all learned how distressed the world of pollinators is. And so they come with a lot of concern and worries. There's almost like there's a building up of stress right now in children of, I think, feeling that sense of emergency of doing something about the natural world we live in. But there's not a lot of answers given to them, I think, on what to do. And I think one of the powerful aspects of public gardens, and in particular what we're doing here with the Arboretum at Penn State, is providing people with a source of inspiration and some of the answers and some of those practices that could be done at their own scale to slowly improve and impact the health of the environment for the world of the species of pollinators. And so here is, I don't know if you've been to Penn State, there's a really ongoing arboretum there. Sherry is a director of horticulture there, and she's wonderful. And the central oval was built. There's a children's garden there. There's the overlook pavilion. There's a series of gardens. And then what you see on the left there, there's funny shapes with a circle and what looks like a wasp wing is kind of the pollinator's garden. And, you know, it's just interesting. I mean, what's coming up when you look at the articles and newspapers is truly a sense of apocalypse and emergency. And so that's kind of what we wanted to see and look at the garden as, is kind of a reflection on that issue and kind of what can we do to inspire people. And so this is just a snapshot of what we were trying to do is collect as much information for the people from the faculties there with really researching the world of pollinators and realizing actually how much unknown there is. Like one of the researchers there admitted, like, they don't even know sometimes some of those species of bees or flies where they really live. And so it's just interesting to see that making a garden, you don't have to know all of the answers to start making something. Making something is a tool for research itself. And so those are some, just listing some of the key principles and knowledge and science that we had to integrate into the making of the garden. Here is a plan of view. And really what it was all about within 4 acres, which is really that question that interests me most on how we craft better cities, is how do you enhance and create as many types of habitats as possible. And this goes from food landscape and orchards and plots to more contemplative meadows and hills and ridges. And one thing we had to do to create this was, again, and that's maybe part of my philosophy, or is how do we sculpt terrain to not only enhance the visitor's experience, but how do we do it in such a way that it also just expands tremendously all of the diversity of conditions for multiple types of plant palettes and plant habitats and so forth. So sculpting the terrain, the field was a very kind of monotonous, fairly just an even slope all across, kind of like an old, like a prairie, you could say, or not a prairie, but like a pasture is a better word. And so creating ripples, and then the thing we did as a way of asking the question, almost like a question of what is the world we live in now? When you arrive, you come from this long axis. I'm going to just go back one slide right there. I don't know if you can see the cursor. And you arrive to this big disk, and that disk is kind of like our planet. It's tilted, it's unbalanced, and in it will be kind of a dry meadow, really a full, like what you're doing when you're doing a pollinator garden, you're pretty much setting up the table. And what you want to make sure of is there's food all the time. It's not just about having just 3 plants and creating a big peak, lots of food in one time, and then it's gone, and then it comes back again. What you need when we learn, one of the essential things we learn is, how is there food at all times, and not only every day, throughout the longest season you can, and as also a way of creating nesting grounds, but how do you make sure there's food in the morning and all time of the day? And that's how you end up with a very successful pollinator habitat. And so that's extremely challenging. And what we had to do as we were sculpting that terrain is to think about the different soil conditions we could create, different solar exposures and shade, deep shade, moist, dry, east facing, west facing, and how we then weave the visitors into this circulation system that will really create that sense of immersion and discovery. And what we have on the lower right corner here on that slide is just almost trying to suggest a map across time, and realizing that the notion of pollination is really more about time management and making sure there's always food and flower coming up at the right time. And so it can't just be spots along it needs to be this continuous, generous source of abundance. And so when we think about how do we do that in a city, and for people, they realize that they're not having to solve everything just in their backyard, but how does it all add up to it? And how do you make sure that you could just enhance that? And one of the, in some ways, easy answer we had for one of the research was really focused on native plants, because in some ways, native plants and native species of pollinators have kind of co-evolved. And so a lot of the species of pollinators that you're trying to attract or provide for are kind of have evolved with those native plants. And so the more you can just go back to your native plants and really expand that collection, the more you know you're going to be able to provide to those. You may also add to it to enhance that food collection. And then all those dots are connected, and how one live on the other one. And our birds, actually, because there's part of a bird habitat with this garden, in some way is going to feed on the pollinator. It's not like we can do a pollinator garden and then a bird garden, and those two worlds are not going to talk. Actually, one is going to feed on the other one. So being aware of those dynamics. And we wanted also, one big question that came is, how comfortable are going to be people to go into a pollinator garden? Because in pretty much what you're doing, you're inviting as many bees and flies and everything that flies and crows, even beetles that are part of the pollination. So how do you have that intense life and feel like people are going to want to be there? And part of the power maybe of the tilted disc was to create something really just beautiful. And you almost arrive at the tilted disc as if you were flying. So you're not threatened. You don't even see the pollinators first. You just arrive at it just as looking at this very intense matrix of flowers. And as you move slowly in the garden, my goal was to compress the scale and let people start to be at eye level with pollinators. I think one of the thing I learned and realized is that you cannot care about something you don't understand. You can't care about something you're not emotionally connected to. If people fall in love with something, they will care about it. And so the same way when we did the Steppe Garden, one of the goals was to raise plants up, because some of those plants are so small, you don't even pay attention, you may even walk on them. The same way I think pollinators are so small that most people don't notice them. They don't take the time to notice them. But if you start to bring them up, what if you find yourself into a space where that's where they live? That was kind of the exploration. So even that big meadow, this is what it's going to feel like when you arrive into it and you see it in the distance. It's very inviting. But as you move through, you can find little spaces like carved into where suddenly pollinators are going to be at your face. And I think I'm interested and curious to see how it's going to create some very meaningful, memorable moments where you find yourself, where you go from pollinators are within people's habitat to then flipping the other way, where you find yourself within the habitat of pollinators. And that's kind of what I was very interested to explore with this garden, is how you can kind of flip the set of relationships between pollinators and people. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the story I wanted to share with you, mostly to what I was trying to convey is our design, that I'm so passionate about, and art, and how powerful it is when we work together and with you all, and when we can draw upon your science and knowledge and really think hard how to make cities better. And for example, right now we're going through a lot of construction projects, including the University of Denver. And sometimes I'm just shocked by the way landscape is treated, and the lack of care sometimes during the implementation, and how much we always push the envelope and put plants on the plant list that maybe are a little harder to find, that you have to go to the Falcons Nursery or Plant Select. And yet, because of the economics, sometimes there's always a desire to simplify it, to say, oh, we can't find that plant. All it takes is just, so we take the time to, I even sometimes go get those plants and drive them to the site. But I know, like, sometimes plants are just so poorly treated. They come on the site, they look like they've been dropped off the truck at least 5 times. And it's just, I think, interesting to me to practice in Colorado, because I think together we can elevate that sense of care and expectations on what it means to nurture health and well-being in a healthy landscape. And so I'm very excited when I see with Tim's lecture, for example, all of the different oaks we can bring into the landscape. And I must say, if I could get access sometime to some of those acorns and things, we have clients actually, University of Denver, they see the steppe landscape, and it's kind of phenomenal to see how they become inspired to transform their landscape, which was all turf when I started working with them 8 years ago, and slowly start to implement much more of the native planting. And so I think I think we see the light in there, and I'm just really thankful to be part of that journey with you all. So thank you. And I don't know if there's time for a question. I'm open to questions.
That was fantastic, Emmanuel. Fantastic presentation. Yes, are there any questions? I love how you tie the landscape into the place. And I think, you know, your outside view of America is really fantastic. It's refreshing because we kind of look at what we have. Well, it's true. You know, you see landscapes quite a bit differently. I'm not a designer, but also with your art background, I think you've come up with some really incredible designs. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, you have Emmanuel's contact info. I'd reach out.
Yes.
You did. And I do have to say that I have one thing for Emmanuel. Oops, I have to put this on. So this event generated the idea that we're all looking at everybody's work, and we're also, is my video on? I hope so.
No, I could stop share mine.
Okay.
So
oh, there we go. So at any rate, this event, we all look at each other's work. We all look at each other's products. And I did not realize what Emmanuel had done in terms of the planning for Denver Botanic Gardens and the Steppe Garden. And I didn't know he's part of the master plan designer for the Chatfield Gardens at Denver Botanic Gardens. Yeah, but I did know Emmanuel back when I worked at Fort Collins Wholesale Nursery. And he's one of the probably 3 people that have ever come up to me as a landscape designer or a landscape architect. I get the build design people asking things, but he's the only landscape architect that actually comes in and says, hey, what do you have that's different and new? And the story is about being on property at Fort Collins Wholesale where they have a yellowhorn, Xanthocereus, which is a plant select plant. And I took him out there. It's about 15 feet tall. And most arborists stand back. They look at the tree, they look at the structure and the leaves and, you know, ask questions about it. And Emmanuel just went in underneath. It was kind of pruned up a little bit and stood underneath and nodded his head and said, I like this space. This is a good space. He started telling me about all the space, the use of space that I was really unaware of, because I look at plants, I maintain plants, but I never look at their use like that. Anyway, so we look at each other's work, and so we did get Emmanuel an award. I haven't gotten it to him yet, and it's a two-part award, but it's we have from a local artist.
Cool.
Art. It's an abstract picture of painting of a Plant Select logo.
That's awesome.
And then we have another award, which of course I left at home. So I will be bringing that by. But congratulations, Emmanuel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. If there are not any other questions.
Actually, I see PK put a question. How would you compare Europe to American design? That's interesting, loaded question. Do you have a couple hours? But I don't know that it's not so different. I think the way you practice as a landscape, the responsibility of the builder is a little different. And I think the expectations maybe are a little bit different, even just between the East Coast and Colorado is a little different. And so when you deliver the landscape and the way it's cared for, it's just a little different. But I would say it's just, to me, it's powerful actually how all those different countries are really working together and sharing information. And I think so APGA is a great conference, and but beside that, like the World Organization of Botanical Gardens is just fascinating on trying to kind of exchange plants and knowledge. So I find that powerful, that exchange of science and passion for plants.
Thank you. Oops, thank you.
You're welcome.
Emmanuel.
Thank you. Yeah.
So what I think we'll do right now is we got a little ahead of time. I thought we might be running behind, but why don't we pick up the conversation at 5 to 11 in about 5 minutes, just over 5 minutes. Wait. There's more questions, Emmanuel. I just saw them. What landscape designers, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, good. What landscape designers have influenced you? And thank you for the great talk. So what landscape designers have influenced you? You know what?
Well, I could say one very good one is when I first moved to Boston. So I was trained I was a painter at the time from the Ecole, and I first moved to Boston. I live right by the work by Olmsted. And what I found powerful about the work by Olmsted in Boston, and you're at the Back Bay fence, is that his landscape with management of water and stormwater in the city, he brought in some of the plants that just carried you back in time to when the place used to be a swamp. And I think that's that day that I fell in love with what landscape could do, landscape architecture, in being a place for people and all that, but it also tells a story. And I feel like when a landscape has a story, that's how you grab onto people's heart. And I think that's what's powerful. Like when I see Mike Bone on Charlotte Rosers tells a story of the Steppe in the Steppe Garden, what a powerful place to tell stories. I think people love stories and they remember stories. They won't remember all of the science and the facts, but the more a landscape, the fact that you can be walking down in the city and come upon a story without expecting it, to me, that's fairly magical.